If you leave her on that bench, she'll be dead before the morning train comes through." The station master didn't move. Neither did the three other men standing within 10 feet of the woman crumpled against the wall. Her lips the color of a bruise. Her coat so thin it wouldn't keep a dog warm. Colt Maddox had ridden through blizzards, buried good men in frozen ground, and built an empire out of nothing but stubborn will. And he had never once walked past something that needed doing. He crouched down beside her, pressed 2 fingers to her throat, and felt the faintest pulse fighting to stay alive. That was enough. Before we go any further, if stories like this one move, you please subscribe to our channel and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The Cheyenne Station in January of 1887 was not a place built for mercy. It was built for commerce, for cattle contracts and freight manifests, and men with money moving fast between one place and another. The waiting area smelled of coal smoke and wet wool, and the particular desperation of people who had been traveling too long. The iron stove in the corner threw heat in a 6-foot circle, and nothing beyond it, and the benches along the walls were full of passengers who stared straight ahead or down at their boots and made every effort not to see what they didn't want to deal with. Clara Whitmore had been on that bench for 3 hours. She had eaten nothing since a crust of bread she'd managed in Denver 40 hours ago. She had slept in fragments upright, her carpet bag clutched to her chest because it held the only thing she had left in the world: her nursing instruments, her certificate from Philadelphia General, a letter of reference she already knew was worthless, and $11.30. She was 28 years old. She had trained for 6 years. She had done everything right, and it had cost her everything anyway. The accusation had come from Dr. Marcus Haverford, chief of medicine at Philadelphia General, the man whose career she had publicly questioned after he performed an amputation on a patient who didn't need one. A patient. Clara had already stabilized a patient who would have kept his leg if Haverford had listened to her notes. He hadn't listened. And when she said so loudly in front of witnesses, Haverford had made a phone call, filed a formal complaint, and within 2 weeks, Clara Whitmore was not just dismissed, she was blacklisted. Every hospital administrator in Philadelphia received a letter, then Boston, then Chicago. His reach was longer than she'd calculated, and by the time she understood how thoroughly he intended to destroy her, the only ticket she could afford was west. She didn't know what was west. She didn't have a plan. She had a direction, and the understanding that staying meant dying slowly in a city that had already closed every door. What she hadn't planned on was her body giving out before she got somewhere new. The cold had gotten into her somewhere around the 3rd hour. Not the sharp cold of stepping outside the deep, settling cold of a body that had stopped fighting it, that had used up the last of its reserves on the train ride, and had nothing left for the waiting. Her hands had gone first, then her feet, and now she was aware of her own heartbeat in a way that frightened her. Too slow. Too deliberate. She knew the signs. She had seen them in patients. She just had never expected to recognize them in herself. She told herself she would stand up in a minute. She told herself she just needed 1 more minute of sitting still, and then she would go to the ticket window and ask about the next train south. Somewhere warmer, somewhere a nurse might find work without a reputation preceding her. She told herself this with the conviction of someone who no longer quite believed it. And then the bench tilted, and the floor came up, and Clara Whitmore did not stand up at all. Colt Maddox was not supposed to be at the Cheyenne Station that afternoon. He had sent his ranchman, Pete Darby, to pick up a supply shipment and handle the freight paperwork, the kind of administrative errand that Colt had been trying to delegate more of since turning 35, and acknowledging privately that he couldn't do every single thing himself. But Pete had sent a wire that morning his daughter had taken sick in Laramie, and he needed to go. Could Colt handle the freight? Colt could handle the freight. He always could. That was the problem and the point. He'd built the Maddox Ranch from 300 acres of scrub and hard clay into one of the largest cattle operations in Wyoming territory. 12,000 acres. 43 full-time hands. A bunkhouse that slept 60 in winter, and a reputation for paying fair wages and expecting serious work. He had done it in 11 years, starting at 24, with money borrowed from a bank that hadn't expected him to pay it back. He had paid it back in 4 years. The banker had sent him a letter of apology and an invitation to dinner. Colt had declined the dinner. I was not a man who needed to be liked. He was a man who needed things to work. He had finished at the freight office and was walking back through the waiting area toward the exit when he saw her go down. Not a dramatic fall, not the kind that made people gasp and rush forward. She simply subsided, leaned too far, and then kept leaning, and then was on the floor with her carpet bag still in her arms, and not a single person in that waiting room moved to help her. Colt stopped walking. He looked at the station master behind his window. The man had seen it. He was looking at some paperwork. He looked at the couple on the nearest bench, a well-dressed man and woman who had visibly edged away. He looked at a younger man by the door who met his eyes and then looked at the ceiling. "If you leave her on that bench," Colt said, and his voice carried the flat authority of someone accustomed to being the last word in any room, "she'll be dead before the morning train comes through." The station master looked up. "Sir, we can't be responsible for every—" "I'm not asking you to be responsible for anything." Colt was already crouching beside her. "I'm telling you what's going to happen if someone doesn't act in the next 10 minutes, and I'm making sure it's on the record that you heard it." He pressed his fingers to her throat. The pulse was there. Weak and too slow and uneven, he didn't like, but there. She was breathing in shallow pulls. Her skin was the wrong color. He'd seen men come in from 3 days in a January storm looking better than this. He picked up her carpet bag, heavier than he'd expected, and then he lifted her, stood without effort, and turned toward the exit. "You can't just take her," the station master called. "I'm not taking her. I'm keeping her alive." He didn't look back. "If she has family or someone looking for her, tell them Colt Maddox. They know how to find me." He took her to the hotel, 2 blocks from the station, the only decent one in Cheyenne, where he kept a standing room for nights when the ride back to the ranch wasn't practical. The woman at the front desk started to say something about unaccompanied guests, looked at Colt's face, and decided against it. He got Clara into the room, onto the bed, and spent the next 40 minutes doing what he knew how to do. Building a fire, getting blankets on her, pressing a warm cloth to her hands and feet, the way his grandmother had shown him when he was 9 years old, and a ranch hand had come in half dead from a winter flood. Slow warming. Don't rush it. The body knows what to do if you give it a chance. She came back in stages. First her breathing deepened. Then the color started to return to her hands. Then she moved a small involuntary pull of her arm toward her body, and Colt sat back and exhaled slowly through his nose. "There you go," he said to no one in particular. 20 minutes later she opened her eyes. She looked at the ceiling first, then at the fire, then at him, and he watched her make the full inventory that he recognized from men waking up after something bad. "Where am I? Am I safe? Who is this? What do I owe?" "You were on the floor at the station," he said before she could ask. "You're at the Cheyenne Grand. You're warm. You're not in any danger." Her voice, when it came, was steadier than he'd expected. "My bag, right here." He set it on the bed beside her. She pulled it to her, immediately checked something inside that he couldn't see, and then seemed to breathe more easily. "Thank you," she said. I need to find the next train south." "You need to eat something first." "I'm fine." "You passed out from cold and hunger in a public waiting room." He kept his voice neutral. "You're not fine. You're functional, which is different." She looked at him with an expression that was trying to decide whether to be offended or grateful, and landed somewhere in between. She had dark circles under her eyes that weren't from one bad night. Her coat was threadbare at the elbows. But her gaze was direct, and her hands, now that the color was coming back, were steady. He noticed the hands particularly. A nurse's hands, certain practiced, used to precision. He had already looked through her carpet bag. Not through her personal items, just at the surface of things, enough to see the instrument roll the worn certificate. He wasn't proud of it, but he was a man who made decisions based on information, and he had needed information. "What's in Denver?" he asked. She blinked. "Excuse me. You said the next train south. There's nothing south of here this time of year except Denver and worse weather." "What's in Denver?" "Nothing," she admitted after a pause too short to be a lie. I was going to figure it out when I got there. And before Denver, her jaw tightened. Philadelphia. Long way from Philadelphia to nowhere in particular. Yes. She didn't offer anything else, and he respected that. A person who could sit quietly with the truth of their own situation without needing to explain. It was a person who knew themselves. He ordered food from the hotel kitchen soup. Bread coffee, strong enough to stand a spoon in, and she ate it without pretense, which also told him something. She wasn't performing composure. She was actually composed under the hunger and the cold and whatever she was carrying out of the East. There was a core to her that the circumstances hadn't touched. I have a problem, he said when she'd gotten through most of the soup. She looked at him over the rim of the coffee cup. Waiting. I have 43 men on a ranch 40 miles outside of town. In January. The nearest doctor is here in Cheyenne, which means by the time I can get a man in to see him and back out again in this weather, he's either better on his own or he's dead. Last month, I lost a hand to a leg infection that a competent person on site could have drained and treated in 20 minutes. He let that settle. I need someone with medical knowledge who can work in rough conditions without a lot of equipment and without the luxury of sending away for help. Clara set down her coffee cup very carefully. I have 43 men, he said again, and I have a ranch that pays better than any hospital in Philadelphia, and I have a spare room in the main house that's warmer than this hotel. And you, he said, have nowhere to go and a set of surgical instruments in that bag that you packed before you packed a change of clothes. You looked in my bag. I looked at your bag. There's a difference. She stared at him. He waited. I don't know anything about you, she said. My name is Colt Maddox. I own the Maddox Ranch. You can ask anyone in Cheyenne whether I'm an honest man, and they'll tell you yes, because I don't have the patience to be anything else. And you want a nurse. I want someone who knows what they're doing in a medical emergency and who isn't going to fall apart when the conditions aren't ideal. Mr. Maddox. Her voice was dry, which he found he liked immediately. I just passed out on a train station floor. I am clearly capable of handling conditions that aren't ideal. He almost smiled. So that's a yes. That is absolutely not a yes. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. That is a woman who nearly died of hypothermia 2 hours ago, asking a man she's never met to explain to her in specific terms what she would be agreeing to if she were to say yes. Fair. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. 43 men. 6 months minimum through the spring thaw. Your own room private locked. 3 meals a day. $20 a month and all medical supplies I can source from Cheyenne, which is most of what you'll need. You treat injuries and illness. You make the calls, I don't second-guess medical decisions. And at the end of 6 months, if you want to go, I'll personally put you on a train to wherever you need to be and pay the fare. Clara was quiet for a long time. You said injuries, she said. Ranch work. Frostbite breaks, cuts, rope burns, horse-related injuries. It's not a surgery theater. But it could be. It could be, he said honestly. And if something is beyond me, then we get to Cheyenne as fast as horses can move, and we hope for the best. Same as we do now, except right now, we don't have anyone. At least with you, we have a fighting chance before we're already loading someone onto a wagon. She looked at the fire. He let her look. He had learned in 11 years of running a large operation, and 20 years before that, of being alive in a world that didn't owe him anything, that the moments when a person was deciding something real were not moments to interrupt. People made better decisions when you let them make them. There's something you should know, she said, not looking at him. All right. I was dismissed from Philadelphia General. There's a formal complaint with the Pennsylvania Medical Board, a false one from the Chief of Medicine, but it exists. If you hire me and someone finds out, it could cause problems for you. Colt was quiet for a moment. What was the complaint? Insubordination, exceeding the scope of nursing practice. She finally looked at him, and there was something careful and steady in her expression, like a person who had decided to tell the truth because they had nothing left to protect. I stabilized a patient with a leg injury that was being overtreated. I documented it. I recommended against the amputation. The surgeon went ahead anyway, and when I reported the outcome, he reported me first. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind had picked up. The patient lost the leg, she said quietly. Because of him. Not because the injury required it. Colt held her gaze. I don't care what the Pennsylvania Medical Board thinks about anything. You should care what, Ms. Whitmore. His voice was even. I'm in Wyoming territory. I run cattle on 12,000 acres. The Pennsylvania Medical Board has never once been relevant to a single day of my life. He stood up, which put him very tall in the small room. What matters to me is whether you can do the work and whether I can trust you. One of those I already know. The other one, I'll find out. She blinked up at him. You already know. You packed your instruments before your clothes. He picked up his hat from the chair. Someone who does that cares about their work more than their comfort. That's what I need. He moved toward the door. I'll give you until morning. I'm in room 4 if you have questions. He had his hand on the door when she spoke. Mr. Maddox. He turned. What was the hand's name? She said. The one who died of the infection. He went still. Tommy Reeves, 22 years old, from Kansas. I'm sorry. She said it simply without performance. Yeah, he said. So am I. He closed the door behind him. Clara did not sleep that night. She sat with the coffee gone cold and thought about what it meant to say yes to a stranger in Wyoming when you had $11.30 and a blacklist that stretched from Philadelphia to Chicago. She thought about Tommy Reed, 22 years old, dead of an infection that she could have treated in her sleep. She thought about what it felt like to know things, to have trained and practiced and earned genuine competence, and to have that competence used against her instead of for anyone's good. She thought about the way Colt Maddox had picked her up off that floor without hesitation, without consultation, without the particular reluctance of a man calculating whether helping was worth the inconvenience. She thought about 12,000 acres and 43 men and a room with a lock on the door. At 6 in the morning, she knocked on the door of room 4. Colt opened it already dressed, which told her he hadn't slept much either, or had simply risen before dawn out of habit. He looked at her without surprise. Yes, she said. With conditions. Name them. I make all medical decisions without interference. If I say a man needs bed rest, he's on bed rest regardless of how short-handed you are. If I say we need to ride to Cheyenne for a physician, we ride to Cheyenne. Agreed. My room is my room, private. I don't answer personal questions I don't want to answer, and the men treat me as a professional. I'll make that clear on day 1. She hesitated. And I want access to whatever medical texts and supply catalogs you can get me. If I'm working out there without a hospital behind me, I need to stay current. I'll write to the Cheyenne medical supplier today, and there's a lending library in Laramie that ships books. He held the door open wider. You want breakfast before we ride? Clara Whitmore looked at him, this enormous, direct, unreadable man, who had picked her up off a floor and offered her a lifeline without flinching, and made the decision she already knew she'd made somewhere around 3 in the morning. Yes, she said. And strong coffee. There's no other kind on my ranch, he said. And it was, she realized, the first time she'd seen anything close to a smile on his face. It was a small thing. Barely a quarter turn at the corner of his mouth. But in a night that had contained almost nothing warm, she found, she held on to it longer than she intended to. The wagon ride to the Maddox Ranch took most of the day, through a landscape that was enormous and white and indifferent to human presence in a way that would have frightened her once. Clara kept her carpetbag on her lap and asked questions about the terrain, about the hands, about the most common injuries, about supply lines, and what he could realistically get from Cheyenne in a week. Colt answered everything directly, without condescension, treating her questions as the professional inquiry they were. By the time the ranch came into view, big, solid, built for permanence rather than impression, Clara had a working mental inventory of what she had to work with and what she needed to obtain in the next 30 days. She had also decided privately that whatever had driven Colt Maddox to spend an evening sitting beside a stranger and keeping her alive, it was something she had not yet seen the whole of. Who lives in the main house? She asked as they pulled through the gate. Just me, he said. Pete Darby, my foreman, lives in the foreman's cottage with his wife. The hands are in the bunkhouse. You'll have the east bedroom. It has the best light in the morning. You thought about the light. I thought about what makes a room workable, he said. He stopped the wagon. A half-dozen men were coming out of the bunkhouse, curious, keeping their distance. These are my people. They're rough and they're good. You treat them well, and they'll carry you out of a burning building. Clara climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help, straightened her coat, and looked at the assembled men looking at her. Gentlemen, she said with the professional calm she had learned in the wards of Philadelphia General. My name is Clara Whitmore. I am your nurse. If any of you are currently ignoring an injury or illness because you thought you could tough it out, I'd like to know about it before it becomes an emergency. That's not weakness. That's sense. Silence. Then from somewhere in the back, got a finger that ain't been right since October, ma'am. Come find me after dinner, she said. We'll take a look. She turned and walked toward the main house, and behind her, she heard the low murmur of men talking, and then unmistakably, a quiet laugh that sounded like relief. Colt Maddox stood by the wagon and watched her walk away, and did not examine the particular quality of the feeling that settled in his chest. He was a practical man. He had solved a problem. That was all this was. He picked up her carpet bag, which she had left in the wagon, either from forgetting or from trusting him with it, and followed her inside. The finger belonged to a man named Hector Ruiz, 31 years old, who had broken it in a gate accident in October and set it himself badly in the dark of the bunkhouse. Clara examined it after dinner in the kitchen of the main house where the light was best, with 5 other hands crowded in the doorway, watching with the cautious fascination of men who had never had a nurse before. It healed crooked, she said, pressing gently along the bone. I can reset it. It's going to hurt. Hector looked at the men in the doorway. How bad? 30 seconds of very bad, Clara said, and then you'll have a functional finger again, instead of one that points at your neighbor. Laughter from the doorway. Hector looked back at her. All right. She reset it clean and fast with no warning and no ceremony, because warning made it worse, and ceremony was just delay. Hector swore once, sharp and loud, and then looked at his hand. That's better, he said, sounding surprised. It'll be sore for a week. Keep it splinted. She was already reaching for the splinting materials she'd laid out. Who's next? 3 more men came forward before the night was done. Colt stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her work and thought about Tommy Reeves dead in January, and about a woman who had packed her instruments before she packed a change of clothes, and about $11.30 between a person and nothing. He did not examine the feeling in his chest. He was a practical man, but he stayed in the doorway until the last man had gone back to the bunkhouse, and when Clara looked up and found him still there, she didn't look surprised either, just tired and competent, and more at home in this rough kitchen with its oil lamp and its borrowed supplies than she had any right to be after a single day. Thank you, she said. For what? For not second-guessing me with Hector. I told you I wouldn't. Men say a lot of things, she said simply. He pushed off the doorframe. Get some sleep. It starts early here. Mr. Maddox. She was wrapping her instruments, not looking at him. The light in the east bedroom. A pause. Thank you for that too. He was almost out of the kitchen when she added quietly to her own hands, and not really to him. I haven't had a room with good light in a long time. Colt Maddox walked down the hall to his own room and sat on the edge of his bed and listened to the wind driving hard against the walls of a house he had built to last, and he thought about a woman who had decided that instruments mattered more than clothes. He did not sleep for a while. He was a practical man. But even practical men sometimes recognize the beginning of something they cannot fully account for, and sit with it in the dark until the morning comes. The east bedroom had good light, and Clara was already awake before it arrived. She had slept 4 hours more than she expected, less than she needed, and lay still in the dark for a moment, listening to a silence so complete it had texture. No city sounds, no carriages, no distant voices, no the particular low groan of a building full of people, just wind and the creak of good timber, and somewhere far off cattle making their presence known to the dark. She was on a ranch in Wyoming. She had $11.30. She had a locked door and a room with good light, and a man down the hall who had not asked a single question she didn't want to answer. She got up and went to work, The first week established the rhythm before anyone named it. Clara was in the kitchen by 5:30 every morning before the hands came in from the early chores, going through the list she'd compiled on the wagon ride out. Who had what? History. Who was carrying an old injury? Who had been coughing since December? Colt appeared each morning at 6, poured 2 cups of coffee without asking, and set one in front of her without ceremony. They did not talk much in the mornings. They didn't need to. He looked at her list. She looked at his face to see if there was anything new, and they both understood that information was the work, and the rest could wait. On the third morning, she caught him reading her notes upside down from across the table. "You can just ask," she said. "Callum's cough. Is it the lungs or just the cold?" "The cold for now. But he smokes too much and his left side sounds wet. I want to watch him for another week." She pulled the notes toward herself. "If it develops, we'll need to discuss getting him to Cheyenne before the passes get worse." Colt nodded slowly. "He won't want to go. I know. He told me last night. I told him what I told you. It's information, not weakness." She glanced up. He listened. Something in Colt's expression shifted. Not surprise exactly. More like recognition, the look of a man recalibrating an estimate upward. "He doesn't listen to me about that. You're his employer. I'm the person who knows what his lungs sound like." She picked up her coffee. "Different kind of authority." Colt was quiet for a moment. Then, "Fair point." That was the first real conversation. By the end of the second week, Clara had treated 14 men for injuries or conditions they'd been carrying silently, in the particular stoic way of men who considered endurance its own form of competence. A shoulder separation that had been compensated for so long, the man walked crooked. 2 cases of frostbitten toes that were 3 more nights from going black. A deep rope burn on a young hand named Jesse Alcott that had started to infect, and which Clara cleaned and packed, without telling him how close it had come to being something much worse. Jesse was 19. He reminded her of the patient she hadn't been able to save in Philadelphia, not in appearance, but in the particular quality of his resilience, the way he worked at full effort and said nothing about what hurt. She found herself being more thorough with him than the injury strictly required, asking about his sleep and his appetite, and whether he'd been taking water regularly. And he answered her questions with the earnest good faith of a young man who had decided quickly and completely to trust her. "You got people back east?" he asked one afternoon while she was changing the dressing on his hand. "No," she said. "Not anymore." "What happened?" She was quiet for a moment. "A man with more power than principles decided I was inconvenient, and the system backed him up." She tied the bandage. "That's how it works sometimes." Jesse looked at his hand. "That ain't right." "No," she said. "It isn't." She picked up the used dressing. "But I'm here and the work is real and that's what I have. Sometimes that has to be enough." He was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Maddox doesn't talk about you to the men." Clara looked at him. "What do you mean?" "Some of the fellas were, talking about why you came out here, and he came into the bunkhouse and said you were a professional, and if anyone treated you otherwise, he'd have a personal conversation with them he guaranteed they wouldn't enjoy." Jesse paused. "He didn't explain you, didn't make excuses, just said it and left." Clara kept her expression neutral. "He told me he would." "Yeah, but..." Jesse seemed to be working out how to say something. "He meant it in a way you can tell from a way that's just talk. You know." She did know. She'd been told a great many things by men who meant them the way weather means rain, casually, without commitment. Colt Maddox had said it the way he said everything, with the particular weight of a man who did not traffic in words he wasn't prepared to back up. "How's the hand feel?" she asked. Jesse flexed his fingers. "Better. A lot better." "Good." She stood. 3 more days on the bandage, then we'll see." The first real crisis came on a Tuesday night 16 days after Clara arrived. A hand named Brody Walsh came in from the north pasture at 9 in the evening, half carried by 2 other men with a color in his face that Clara recognized before he was through the door. She was in the main house, had been reviewing the supply inventory, and she heard the commotion and was in the hallway before anyone called for her. "What happened?" she said. Not a question, a command for information. "Horse through him. He hit the fence post. We think he maybe..." Don't think. Tell me what you saw. She was already kneeling beside Brody, who was conscious, but barely. His breathing labored in a way that made the back of her neck prickle. She pressed along his ribs, and he made a sound that told her everything she needed. 2 broken ribs at minimum, she said, and I need to know if he landed on his head. He was wearing his hat, the second man offered. That's not... She stopped. This was not the moment to explain hat physics. Did he lose consciousness at any point between the fence and here? For a minute, maybe 2. She didn't like that. She kept her hands moving, methodical, checking for the signs she'd been taught to look for, and had hoped never to need out here in a kitchen with no hospital behind her. Brody looked up at her with the glassy, cooperative expression of a man who was hurting too much to be embarrassed. Am I gonna make it? He asked. You're going to be fine, she said with the calm, professional certainty she'd cultivated in 6 years of ward work. The tone that wasn't false comfort, but wasn't the full truth either. It was the tone of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and needed the patient to believe that so they could do it. I need you to stay very still and breathe as normally as you can. Don't fight the breathing. She looked up at the men in the doorway. Get Mr. Maddox. How was there in 4 minutes? She heard his boots on the stairs before she saw him fast, but not running, the stride of a man who moved at the pace the situation required, and not a fraction faster or slower. He took in the scene in a single look. How bad? 2 ribs, possibly 3. I'm worried about a pneumothorax, air in the chest cavity. I need to listen to his lungs, and I need quiet. She held out a hand. My stethoscope is in the black case on the east bedroom windowsill, 2nd shelf. He was gone and back in 90 seconds, which meant he hadn't hesitated at her door, hadn't thought about whether to go in or send someone else. He'd just gone and gotten it, because the work needed it done. She listened. The left side was compromised. Not a full pneumothorax yet, but the early signs were there. She sat back on her heels and thought very fast about what she had and what she could do, and what the margin of error was. He needs monitoring through the night, she said. If his breathing gets worse, or his lips go blue, you wake me immediately regardless of the hour. Not at dawn. Immediately. I'll stay with him, Colt said. She looked up. He was already pulling a chair toward Brody's side with the matter-of-fact practicality of a man who had made a decision and was implementing it. No discussion, no weighing of whether it was his job. His man was hurt. He was staying. Something moved in Clara's chest that she did not have time for. Wake me if anything changes, she said. I'll check him every 2 hours. She checked him 4 times that night, and each time she appeared in the doorway, Colt was awake and watching Brody and looked up at her with the specific quality of alertness that told her he hadn't been sleeping between her visits. The 4th time at 4 in the morning, she found him sitting forward with his elbows on his knees, and Brody's breathing had stabilized and the color was better. He's through the worst of it, she said quietly. Colt exhaled a long, slow breath that told her more about what the night had cost him than anything he would have said in words. You sure? Reasonably sure. I want to watch him for another 48 hours, and he's not going on a horse for 3 weeks minimum. She looked at Brody, sleeping now, genuinely sleeping. But yes, he's through it. Colt leaned back in the chair and rubbed a hand across his face. Tommy Reeves died on a Wednesday, he said, not to anyone in particular. I keep thinking about that. Clara sat down on the edge of the low bench across from him. It wasn't the same injury. No, but it was the same thing, me sitting in a chair watching a man and not having enough to help him with. He looked at his hands. I didn't know what I was looking for. I just sat there while he got worse. You know what to look for now, she said. He looked at her. The lamp was low and the room was very quiet, and he looked at her with an expression that was direct in the way. All his expressions were direct. No deflection, no performance. But there was something underneath it that she had not seen before. Yeah, he said. I do. She went back to her room at 4:30 and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about a man sitting in a chair all night because his ranch hand needed someone there, and the way he'd said, Tommy Reeves died on a Wednesday, not as an accusation, not as a question, just as a fact. He was still living with 2 months later that he hadn't put down yet. She thought about men with power and men with character, and the distance between those two things, and the rarity of finding them in the same person. She was not examining the feeling. She was simply noting it. Professionally. As data, she slept 2 hours and was back in the kitchen by 6:30, and when Colt came down and saw the coffee already made, he looked at her with something that was 3/4 tiredness and 1/4 something else entirely, and poured himself a cup without a word. That was the second real conversation. Brody recovered. By the end of the first week, he was complaining about the bed rest, which Clara took as the most reliable indicator of returning health, and by day 10, he was attempting to argue his way back to light work. She held the line. 3 weeks, she said. I told you 3 weeks. I'm fine, listen. He demonstrated breathing theatrically. Completely fine. Brody. She held up his chart, the careful daily notation she'd been keeping: lung sounds and pulse and color and pain level. Do you see this number? He squinted at it. That's your respiratory capacity measured against baseline. It is not at baseline, which means the ribs are not healed, which means if you go out there and take a hard fall or strain that side, we will be back at day 1, and next time, I cannot promise you the outcome Brody had the first time. She lowered the chart. 2 more weeks. Then we reassess. He stared at her. You're meaner than you look. I look very kind, she said. That's deliberate. It gets people to let me examine them. She picked up the chart. 2 weeks. He grumbled. But he stayed in bed. Colt, who had been standing in the doorway, waited until Brody was occupied, complaining to the man in the next bunk, before he caught Clara's eye and raised an eyebrow, a fraction of an expression that she was learning translated as well handled. She raised one back. I know. The ease of it startled her slightly in the privacy of her own chest. 16 days in, and they had already developed a shorthand that operated below language in the currency of glances and timing, and the mutual understanding of two people who were both fundamentally trying to keep the same things from breaking. She had not had that with anyone in Philadelphia. She had not had it anywhere, she realized, except the ward at Philadelphia General, in the years before Haverford, when the work was good and the purpose was clear, and she had believed the place was making her into something that would matter. She had not expected to find it here. The letter came on the last Friday of January, forwarded from the Cheyenne post office by a writer who came out twice a week. Colt brought it to her directly, which meant he had looked at the return address. She saw his face before she saw the envelope, and she knew from his expression alone that it was not good news. The seal was the Pennsylvania State Medical Board. She opened it at the kitchen table, and Colt stayed, which she noticed and did not ask about. He leaned against the counter and was quiet while she read. The complaint filed by Dr. Marcus Haverford had been formally accepted for review. She was required to respond in writing within 60 days. Failure to respond would be treated as implicit acknowledgement of the charges. The charges included practicing beyond the sanctioned scope of nursing practice, insubordination in a clinical setting. And this was new, and her stomach went tight when she read it, falsifying patient notes. She read that line twice. He added falsification, she said to the table. That wasn't in the original complaint. No, that's new. She folded the letter carefully with the precise, controlled movements of someone who was furious and had decided not to be yet, because fury was not useful information. He's escalating. He knows I've left Philadelphia, which means someone told him. He knows he needs to hit harder if I'm not there to defend myself in person. You'll respond. With what I have my own records. I have what I documented. But he has the institutional weight of a major hospital, and I have a forwarding address in Wyoming. She set the letter down. Any board in Philadelphia will take his word over mine. Then we don't fight it in Philadelphia. Colt crossed his arms. You've been here 3 weeks. You've treated 22 men. I know every one of them, and I know what you did for them, and I know what would have happened without you. His voice was level and completely certain. That's 22 testimonies, plus Pete Darby's wife, who you saw about her ankle last week, and who told Pete it was the first time in 3 years she'd been to a medical person who actually listened. Clara looked at him. They wouldn't. They would, he said flatly. Every single one of them. You want to write to that board, you write. But you write from a position of what you've actually done, not what Haverford says you are. And you build that record every day you're here. He pushed off the counter. 6 months was the deal. By 6 months I'll have more testimony than that board has ever seen for one person. She stared at him. Why? She asked, and the word came out before she could reconsider it. He looked at her for a moment, that direct, undeflected look that had no artifice in it. Because it's the right thing to do, he said. And because Tommy Reeves died of an infected leg in January, and you haven't let a single man on this ranch get close to that. He walked out of the kitchen. Clara sat with the letter and the coffee, and the particular quality of silence that follows something that has shifted the weight of a room, and she breathed through what she was feeling with the discipline of a woman who had learned to treat her own reactions as clinical data. The data, she acknowledged quietly, was not purely professional. She picked up her pen and began to write. February came in like a fist. 3 days of snowfall that cut the ranch off from the road to Cheyenne, that piled drifts against the bunkhouse doors, and turned every outdoor task into a calculated risk. Clara spent the confinement reorganizing her supplies, updating her patient notes, and reading the 2 medical texts that had arrived from the Laramie Lending Library. One on field surgery, one on pulmonary conditions in high altitudes, with the focused appetite of someone who understands that knowledge is the only resource that doesn't run out. Colt spent the snow days working from the main house. Ledgers, supply orders, correspondence, and they developed the habit, without discussing it, of sharing the kitchen table in the afternoons, each occupied with their own work, occasionally exchanging information that was relevant to the other. He would tell her about a supplier in Denver who could get carbolic acid at better prices than Cheyenne. She would tell him that 2 of the men were showing early signs of respiratory strain from the cold and needed lighter work until the temperature came up. They talked about practical things and let the silence between them be comfortable, and asked nothing that wasn't necessary. It was, Clara thought privately, one of the most honest arrangements she'd ever been part of. On the second snow day, Colt looked up from his ledger and said without preamble, "You ever think about going back? To Philadelphia? To a city, a hospital, what you trained for?" She considered the question seriously, the way he tended to ask things not as small talk, but as genuine inquiry. "I think about it as something that was taken from me," she said. "Not as something I'd choose to return to even if I could. The hospital was good until it wasn't. The work is the same work wherever I do it." She glanced at her notes. "Callum's lungs are better since I adjusted his sleeping position and got him off the tobacco 3 weeks ago. He would have been on a ward in Cheyenne by now if things had gone differently." She looked up. "That matters to me as much as anything I did in Philadelphia. Maybe more." Colt held her gaze for a moment. "You're good at it," he said. "Not just technically, the way you talk to them. They trust you." "Trust is a medical tool," she said. "A patient who trusts you tells you the truth about their pain. A patient who doesn't tells you what they think you want to hear, and you treat the wrong thing." "Where'd you learn that?" "A ward supervisor named Helen Cross. She'd been nursing for 30 years, and she had more practical sense than every physician I ever worked with." Clara smiled slightly, a real one, involuntary. "She told me the first week they'll lie to the doctors about how bad it is because doctors frighten them. They'll tell you the truth if you earn it." She was right. Sounds like a remarkable woman. She was. A beat. "She was the first person I told about what Haverford did to that patient. She believed me immediately." Clara looked at the table. "And then she told me there was nothing she could do about it, and she was sorry, and she went back to work." She said it without bitterness, or rather with the kind of bitterness that has been examined and set aside without being denied. She had her own 30 years to protect. I understood that. Colt was quiet for a moment. "Did it help that she believed you?" Clara considered. "Yes," she said honestly. "It did. It meant the truth was real, even if the outcome was wrong." She picked up her pen. "That's all truth ever does in the end. It means the thing happened. It doesn't guarantee the right ending." The wind drove at the windows. The stove ticked. "I believe you," Colt said simply, and without fanfare, returning to his ledger. Clara did not look up. She kept her pen moving, but she held those 3 words in the particular internal space she reserved for things that mattered and deserved to be kept carefully. She had said it to Helen Cross, and Helen Cross had believed her and been sorry and done nothing. Colt Maddox believed her, and he was already building the record. The difference between those 2 things was not small. Outside, the snow was still falling, and the ranch was still standing, and 38 men were warm and breathing, and none of them were. Tommy Reeves and Clara Whitmore wrote her response to the Pennsylvania State Medical Board by lamplight with the calm certainty of someone who had somewhere in the last 3 weeks stopped running and started building. She was not sure exactly when it had happened. She was sure that it had. The response Clara sent to the Pennsylvania State Medical Board was 4 pages long, precise and documented, with the kind of careful detail that came from a woman who had learned the hard way to write everything down. Colt read it before she sealed the envelope. She hadn't asked him to. She'd simply left it on the kitchen table and gone to check on Brody, and when she came back, he was on the last page reading with the focused attention he gave to everything that mattered. He set it down when she came in and looked at her with an expression that was close to approval. "It's good," he said. "It's accurate. Same thing in the right hands." He slid it back across the table. "Add Pete Darby's name. He'll sign a supporting statement. His wife, too." "I already have 23 names." "Make it 25. He picked up his coffee. "Haverford is going to make noise. Make more." She sealed the envelope, and Pete Darby wrote it to Cheyenne that afternoon, and Clara went back to work with the particular settled feeling of someone who has done what they can and decided to let it move at its own speed. The medical board could wait. Wyoming could not. March arrived with a false warmth that fooled everyone for 4 days, and then turned vicious, and it was in the tail end of that false warmth that Jesse Alcott did something that nearly killed him. He had been moving cattle with 2 other hands along the northern fence line when the temperature dropped 30 degrees in 2 hours, the kind of drop that the old hands knew to read, and the young ones hadn't learned yet. He had sent the other 2 back ahead of him to deal with a stuck gate, and by the time they realized he hadn't followed, an hour had passed, and the wind had come up hard, and Jesse was on the ground 40 yards from the fence, with his horse standing over him like it was trying to decide what to do. They brought him in on a plank. Clara heard the commotion from the bunkhouse where she'd been treating a mild case of chilblains on an older hand, and she was at the door before anyone shouted her name. She saw his color first, then his breathing, then the way his hands were clenched even though he was barely conscious, the involuntary muscle contraction of a body fighting hypothermia with everything it had left. "Get him inside," she said. "Not the bunkhouse, the main house kitchen, the stove." "He's not," one of the men started. "I know what he is." She was already moving. "Kitchen, now." What followed was 40 minutes of controlled, focused work that Clara performed with the full force of everything Helen Cross had ever taught her, and everything she'd taught herself in the years since, all of it compressed into a narrow channel of purpose, with no room for fear or uncertainty, or the particular knowledge pressing at the edges of her awareness that this was Jesse, 19 years old, who had trusted her with his sore hand and his quiet resilience and the earnest good faith of someone who hadn't yet learned to be cynical. She stripped the wet clothing. She packed warm compresses at his neck and armpits and groin, the major blood vessels, the fastest path to core warming. She monitored his pulse with 2 fingers and counted and recounted, watching for the arrhythmia that could kill a hypothermia patient faster than the cold itself. She talked to him in a low, steady voice that was not performing calm, but was calm the way a river is calm when it runs deep and fast and knows exactly where it's going. "Stay with me, Jesse. Your body knows how to do this. I just need you to stay with me." Colt was there. She was aware of him at the edge of her vision, not in the way, never in the way, but there in the specific manner she had come to rely on without meaning to present, and ready and watching for what she needed before she had to ask for it. "Hot water," she said. It was there. More blankets, not directly on his skin yet, around the compresses. Done. Someone hold his head, he might seize. A hand appeared. Reliable. Steady. Colt's hand. The seizure came at minute 22. Brief, controlled, the kind that meant the body was waking up, and not the kind that meant it was shutting down. Clara held Jesse's gaze through it, and kept counting, and kept her voice level, and thought about Tommy Reeves, and thought about the fence post, and thought about everything she was not going to let happen to this particular 19-year-old from Kansas tonight. The seizure passed. Jesse's color began to change. By minute 40, he was conscious enough to try to talk, and Clara said, "Don't," with enough authority that he stopped immediately. By hour 2, he was shivering actively, which was exactly what she wanted to see, the body running its own heat again, fighting for itself. "He's going to be all right," she said. The room exhaled. She became aware only then of how many people were in the kitchen. 6-8 crowded into the space because their friend was in it, and they had needed to be close. Big men. Rough men who drove cattle in January storms without complaint, standing in a kitchen doorway, with their hats in their hands, absolutely quiet. "He needs sleep and heat and water when he wakes," she said to the room. "He can have both bunkhouses arguing over who gets to sit with him as long as someone stays awake. Wake me if anything changes." She washed her hands at the basin. Her own hands, she noticed, were completely steady. She had not realized until this moment that she had expected them not to be. Behind her, she heard Colt say to no one, to everyone, "That's why she's here." She didn't turn around. She dried her hands, picked up her kit, and went to her room, and sat on the edge of the bed, and let herself feel all the things she hadn't had time to feel for the past 2 hours. The fear, the focus, the absolute refusal to accept a particular outcome. The relief that arrived, not with noise, but with the quiet, heavy certainty of something that had almost happened and didn't. She thought about Jesse's pulse under her fingers. She thought about Colt's hand steady at Jesse's head for 40 minutes without moving. She thought about what it meant to trust someone so completely that you never had to say the word. Jesse recovered in 6 days. On the 7th, he tried to get out of bed before she cleared him, and she appeared in the bunkhouse doorway with the chart and the specific expression that Hector had once described to considerable group laughter as, "the face that means you've already lost the argument." Jesse got back in bed. "2 more days," she said. "I feel 2 more days, Jesse." He looked at Colt, who was leaning against the bunkhouse wall with his arms crossed. "Don't look at him," Clara said. "He doesn't outrank me in this building." Laughter from the other bunks. Colt raised both hands in surrender. Jesse pulled the blanket back up. It was the first time the men had laughed easily around her. Not the nervous, polite laughter of people trying to make a stranger comfortable, but the real kind, the kind that meant she was inside the circle now, and not just adjacent to it. She had not been looking for it, but she noticed it the way you notice when a weight you'd stopped counting has been lifted. The pneumonia came for Callum Reed on a Wednesday night in the 2nd week of March, fast and brutal, and exactly the way Clara had feared it would come if they didn't manage it carefully. She had been managing it carefully for 6 weeks. She had monitored his lungs twice a week, adjusted his sleeping position, gotten him off the tobacco through a combination of clinical argument and personal stubbornness that had involved 3 conversations in which Callum said things to her that she let go because she understood they were coming from fear and not from him. But the cold had been relentless, and the wet had gotten into the bunkhouse through a gap in the north wall that hadn't been fully repaired. And on Wednesday night, Callum's temperature went to 104, and his left lung was almost completely compromised, and Clara stood at his bunk and made a fast, clear-eyed assessment of what she had versus what she needed. She had quinine, which would help the fever. She had the steam treatment she'd been using since the 1st week. She did not have the hospital behind her. She did not have a physician to consult. She had herself and her training and 6 years of watching things go wrong and learning to read the edge between manageable and catastrophic. This was close to the edge. She went to Colt's door at 11:30 at night and knocked twice. He opened it already awake. She had stopped asking herself how he managed that. "Callum," she said, "I need to tell you honestly where we are." He stepped into the hallway and pulled the door nearly closed behind him. "Tell me." "His left lung is bad. The fever is high but manageable with what I have. The lung is the problem." She kept her voice level and precise. "I can treat him here. I believe I can pull him through. But I want you to know that my confidence is strong but not absolute. If he were in a hospital, I would feel differently. He is not in a hospital." Colt looked at her for a moment. Outside the wind was high, and the road to Cheyenne was 2 hours in good conditions, and the temperature was 22 degrees. "What do you need?" he said. "I need a fire burning in the bunkhouse all night. I need 3 men on rotation to keep it running while I watch him. I need the steam kettle going every 4 hours, and I need you to stay out of the room unless I call you." "Done." He moved. "What else?" "That's it for tonight." She turned to go back. "Colt." He stopped. She had used his first name. She hadn't planned it. It had come out in the particular clarity of midnight and high stakes, and the understanding that some distances are artificial and become impossible to maintain at the edge of something real. "If I make a call tonight that looks extreme," she said, "I need you to trust it." "I already do," he said. "Go." She went. The next 8 hours were the hardest work she had done since Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia, she'd had a full hospital ward around her. She used everything she knew. She changed his position every 40 minutes to keep the fluid from settling. She ran the steam treatment and monitored his breathing with the focus of someone who was listening for a specific sound and refusing to hear the wrong one. She talked to Callum through the fever, not because he could fully understand her, but because her voice gave him something to orient toward. Something that wasn't the heat and confusion of a body turning against itself. At 3 in the morning, his fever broke. It came back. At 5, it broke again, lower this time. She watched the number come down on her thermometer with the same expression she used for everything neutral on the surface, a long way from neutral underneath, and she breathed out through her nose and let herself believe cautiously that they were going the right direction. At 6:45, Callum opened his eyes and looked at her, and said in a hoarse wreck of a voice, "Did I die?" "Not today," she said. "And not for a long time if you do what I tell you." "What do you want me to do?" "Stop smoking. Permanently this time. I mean it." He looked at the ceiling. "That bad? That bad?" A long pause. "All right," he said. "All right." She was rewrapping her stethoscope when Colt appeared in the bunkhouse doorway. He looked at Callum, then at her. She gave him the smallest nod, barely a movement, just a degree of inclination, and watched his shoulders drop a fraction of an inch. He crossed the room, put a hand briefly on Callum's shoulder, said nothing, and walked back out. She followed him into the cold morning air, and they stood there for a moment outside the bunkhouse, not talking, in the particular silence that exists after something very bad has been prevented at the last reasonable moment. "You should sleep," he said. "I will." She looked at the sky, which was just starting to change. "Thank you for last night. I didn't do anything. You trusted me without asking me to explain myself at midnight in a hallway." She turned to go in. "That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot." She slept 4 hours and woke to find a fresh pot of coffee on the stove and a note in Colt's handwriting that said, "Pete fixed the north wall. 3 layers of insulation. Won't happen again." She read it twice. She put it in her pocket and went to check on Callum. The barn fire happened on a Friday afternoon when the wind was wrong and someone left a lantern too close to a hay bale, and there was nothing gradual about it. One moment everything was the ordinary danger of a working ranch in March. The next there was shouting and smoke and men running, and the particular sound of horses that are terrified, which is unlike any other sound in the world. Clara was in the main house when she heard it, and she grabbed her kit without thinking and ran toward the noise, because that was who she was and what she did. And she arrived to find 3 men already pulling horses out, and 2 more trying to beat down the near side of the fire with wet burlap, and Colt in the middle of it, directing with the flat carrying authority of a man who had been managing crises his whole life. "Left gate, Hector, take the left gate. Jesse, stay back. You are staying back." Jesse, to his credit, stayed back. The man who didn't stay back was a hand named Ward Connolly, 51 years old, 20 years on the ranch, who went in for a horse that was still in the far stall and came out 12 seconds later without the horse, and with a beam's worth of sparks across his right arm and a burn that made Clara's stomach clench the moment she saw it. "Sit down," she said, and took his arm, and Ward sat down because she had said it, and because 30 seconds earlier he'd been on fire. The burn was bad. Not immediately life-threatening, but deep enough and extensive enough on the forearm that she was calculating infection risk and nerve involvement before she'd finished the first assessment. She packed it immediately with what she had. Clean cloth. The cold water. Someone ran to her, her own carbolic acid solution that she kept in the kit for exactly this kind of emergency, and talked Ward through the pain with the focused, even voice that was its own kind of medicine. "You're all right," she said. "I have you. Stay with me." "The horse," Ward said. "The horse can be replaced," Colt said from 2 feet away. She hadn't heard him come over. His voice was rough. "You cannot, Clara." "He needs Cheyenne," she said without looking up. "Tomorrow if he's stable overnight. Not tonight. The wound needs to be dressed properly, and I need to watch for infection setting in before we move him." "Tomorrow," Colt confirmed. "I'll need to ride with him." A pause. "All right." She kept working, and Ward kept breathing, and around them the fire was brought down to nothing by the coordinated effort of 40 men who knew exactly what to do, because they'd been trained by a man who thought about contingencies before they happened. The horse that Ward had gone back for was found at the fence line an hour later. Frightened, but uninjured. Someone brought it back in, and Colt walked up to it and pressed his forehead briefly against the animal's neck in the gesture of a man who is grateful for things he isn't going to explain. That night, sitting with Ward in the main house, while she monitored the burn dressing through the hours, Clara thought about what it meant to build something. Really build it, the way Colt had built this ranch, and these people, and this particular quality of loyalty that made a 51-year-old man walk into a burning building for a horse, and made 40 others run toward the fire instead of away from it. She had spent 6 years in Philadelphia trying to build something like that. She had done it in rooms and wards, and the intimate daily work of being trusted with people's bodies and pain. And then one man with more power than conscience had taken 20 minutes to dismantle it. She looked at Ward's arm. She looked at her own hands. She had rebuilt it in 6 weeks on a Wyoming ranch with a supply kit and a borrowed stethoscope and a man who handed her coffee every morning without making it a conversation. At 2 in the morning, Colt came in with water and sat in the chair across from her and looked at Ward sleeping and said quietly, "He's going to keep the arm." "Yes," she said. "Full function with proper treatment and time." "How much time?" 6 weeks before he works. 8 before he works hard." Colt nodded. He was quiet for a moment. "You went straight for him, before the fire was out." "That's what I do." "I know." He turned the water glass in his hands. "I'm glad you're here, Clara." The second time her name. The first time he'd said it, like it meant something. Not a practical designation, but a particular thing specific and considered directed at her and no one else. She looked at the fire in the stove. She thought about the Cheyenne train station and a bench and $11.30, and the particular desperate pragmatism of a woman who had accepted an offer from a stranger because there was nowhere else to go. She thought about how somewhere between Brody's ribs and Jesse's hypothermia and Callum's fever and Ward's burning arm, the calculation had changed. She was not here because she had nowhere else to go. She was here because here was where she needed to be. "I'm glad I'm here too," she said. The fire burned. Ward slept. Outside the ranch was quiet and intact, and full of men who would be alive tomorrow, who might not have been, and the distance between Colt Maddox's chair and Clara Whitmore's chair was smaller than it had been the night before, and smaller again than the night before that. Neither of them moved. Neither of them needed to. Some distances close themselves if you give them enough time and enough truth, and neither person walks away. Ward Connolly rode to Cheyenne on a wagon bench the next morning, with his arm dressed and splinted, and Clara sitting beside him, and he spent the journey telling her about the first horse he'd ever owned, a gray mare named Patience, and how he'd traded 2 months of wages for her when he was 17, and she'd thrown him 6 times in the first week, and he'd gotten back on every single time, because he'd decided she was worth it. "Why are you telling me this?" Clara asked, somewhere around the halfway point. Ward looked at his arm. "Because you're the reason I still have that hand," he said. "And I wanted you to know something real about me before we got there." She didn't answer for a moment. "Tell me about Patience," she said. He told her. And she listened, the way she listened to everything fully, without dividing her attention, and by the time they reached Cheyenne, she knew that Ward Connolly had worked ranches for 34 years, had never married, sent money to a sister in Missouri every month without fail, and had a scar on his left knee from the second time patients threw him that he still considered the most honest thing that had ever happened to him. The Cheyenne physician, a competent man named Dr. Aldous Fitch, who had been practicing in Wyoming for 15 years, examined Ward's arm and then examined Clara's dressing and said without looking up, "Whoever packed this knew what they were doing. Clean edges, correct layering, carbolic solution applied at the right density. This arm would have been at serious risk without this level of immediate treatment." "Miss Whitmore," Ward said. "She's our nurse at the Maddox Ranch." Dr. Fitch looked at her then. "You trained in Philadelphia, you said. Philadelphia General." He nodded slowly. "I've heard the name Whitmore," he said, and something in his expression was careful. "In connection with a complaint." Clara met his gaze directly. "Haverford's complaint, yes." Howe was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Ward's arm again and said, "I would have done this the same way, to the letter." He set down his instruments. "If you need a reference from a Wyoming physician, Miss Whitmore, you can use my name." She had not expected that. She kept her expression professional, but she held on to it, the unexpected weight of it, unsolicited and clean from a man who had no stake in her vindication except the evidence in front of him. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me. That arm thanks you." He turned to write his notes. "Now let me show you the secondary dressing technique I've been using for deep burns. You may find it useful." She stayed an extra hour in Dr. Fitch's office, not because Ward needed it, but because there was a physician in Wyoming who was willing to treat her as a colleague, and she was not going to waste that. The letter from the medical board arrived on a Thursday in early April, 6 weeks after Clara's response had gone east. She was in the middle of a straightforward examination. Hector's finger now fully healed, which she was clearing for full work. When Pete Darby's wife Margaret knocked on the kitchen door and held out an envelope with the Pennsylvania seal, and the particular expression of a woman who understood that envelopes from official bodies were either very good or very bad, and couldn't tell which this was, Clara finished Hector's examination first. She cleared his finger, told him to come back if it gave him trouble, and waited until he was out the door before she picked up the envelope. Margaret stayed. Clara didn't ask her to leave. In the 3 months since Clara had treated Margaret's ankle and listened to her talk for 40 minutes about the difficulty of being a ranch foreman's wife in a territory that had no use for her skills, they had arrived at a friendship that neither of them named, but both of them relied on. Clara opened the letter. The board acknowledged her response. They had reviewed her documentation. They found her initial submission detailed and professionally credible. However, and here the language became careful in a way that Clara recognized from institutions protecting themselves. The complaint from Dr. Haverford included additional signed testimony from 2 Philadelphia General staff members, and the board required either an in-person hearing or additional corroborating evidence from licensed physicians before proceeding. "What does it mean?" Margaret asked. "It means Haverford got to 2 people." Clara set the letter down with complete steadiness. "And it means they want more than letters from ranch hands. They have Dr. Fitch. They want more than one." She thought for a moment. "They want me vulnerable. An in-person hearing in Philadelphia means I travel on my own money to a city where he has institutional weight and I have none. The corroborating evidence option is the path." She looked at the letter. "I need physicians, multiple, willing to put their names to paper for a nurse they've never met." "Colt will find them," Margaret said with the flat certainty of a woman who had watched a man operate for a long time. "This isn't his problem to solve." Margaret looked at her with an expression that was not unkind, but was entirely without patience. "Clara," she said, "that man had a standing room at the Cheyenne Grand for 2 years because he worked too hard to ride home. He has used that room exactly twice since January. Both times because you needed to get to Cheyenne for a patient." She folded her hands. "I think you know what that means, and I think you're being careful about it, which I respect. But don't confuse careful with blind." Clara was quiet for the long moment. "He needs to know about the letter," she said finally. "He does. Margaret agreed. She told him that evening at the kitchen table with the letter between them and 2 cups of coffee going cold because neither of them was drinking. Colt read it twice. Then he put it down and looked at the wall above her head for a moment, which she had learned was what he did when he was thinking hard and didn't want the thinking to be visible. "Fitch will sign," he said. "He already offered." "One physician isn't enough. I know 3 physicians in Wyoming Territory who owe me a professional courtesy." He looked at her. "Not favors. I'm not asking anyone to lie. I'm asking them to examine your record and your work and sign their name to what they actually find." He paused. "I'm also going to contact the territorial governor's office." Clara stared at him. "Why?" "Because Marcus Haverford is trying to use a Pennsylvania institution to suppress a licensed medical professional working in Wyoming Territory, and the territorial governor has an interest in whether Pennsylvania medical boards have jurisdiction over Wyoming medical practice." He said it the way he said practical things, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a logical next step. It may not be relevant, but it creates a different kind of noise. That is Colt, that is a considerable undertaking for someone else's problem. He looked at her directly, and there was something in it that was done with the careful indirection they'd both been using for 4 months. "It's not someone else's problem," he said. "I need you to understand that clearly." The kitchen was very still. She needed to say something. She had been a professionally precise person her entire adult life, trained to deliver information accurately and receive it the same way. And right now she was looking at a man who had just said something as close to "you matter to me" as a man like him was built to say in a practical context, and the accurate response was complicated. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "When I got on that train west," she said, "I had decided I was finished with anything that looked like dependence. On an institution, on a system, on a person. I had built everything on my own terms, and then I watched those terms get overruled by one man's ego, and I decided that the only safe way to operate was alone." She looked at her hands. "And then you picked me up off a floor and gave me a room with good light and stood in a bunkhouse doorway and held a man's head for 40 minutes and never once made me feel like I owed you anything for any of it." The fire crackled. "I don't want you fighting this because you feel responsible for me," she said. "I'm not." His voice was quiet and absolutely certain. "I'm fighting this because you are the best person I have met in 11 years of building something, and Haverford is a coward with a pen, and I don't lose to cowards with pens." He paused. "And because you matter to me, as directly as I know how to say it." Clara looked at him for a long, considered moment. Then, "All right. All right. Write to the physicians. Write to the governor's office. Let me review everything before it goes." She picked up the letter. "And understand that I'm not a problem you're solving. I'm a person you're helping. There's a difference." The corner of his mouth moved. "I know the difference." "Good." She stood. "Then we have work to do." April built a case. Dr. Fitch signed a formal letter that ran to 3 pages detailing Ward's injury, Clara's treatment, and his professional assessment of her competence. Colt rode to Laramie personally and spent a day with a physician named Dr. Henry Marsh, who had delivered half the babies in Wyoming Territory and whose name carried more weight in the West than any Philadelphia title. Dr. Marsh examined Clara's patient records, asked her 45 minutes of sharp clinical questions, and then signed a letter that was 7 paragraphs long and used the phrase exemplary field medicine in the second paragraph. A physician in Casper, Dr. Lena Hargrove, the only female physician in Wyoming Territory, which Colt had found through deliberate inquiry, wrote a letter that was brief and devastating in its precision. The charges against Miss Whitmore described the behavior of an insubordinate. "What I see in her records is the behavior of a diagnostician who was correct. These are not the same thing, and any medical board that cannot distinguish between them is not qualified to evaluate practitioners." Clara read that one twice. Then she folded it very carefully and put it at the front of the file. Pete Darby collected signed statements from every man on the ranch who had been treated by Clara, 31 statements each describing in plain language what the injury or illness had been, what Clara had done, and what the outcome was. He organized them himself alphabetically with a cover note in his own handwriting that said, "These are men who work hard and don't complain and don't exaggerate. Every word in here is true." The file grew thick. And then, in the second week of April, the twist came from a direction Clara hadn't anticipated. A woman named Agnes Doyle arrived at the Maddox Ranch on a Tuesday afternoon, having ridden from Cheyenne with her husband and 2 children. She was 34 years old, and she had heard through the particular network of word and wire that operated in small western towns that there was a nurse at the Maddox Ranch who had treated a serious burn and a near-fatal hypothermia case and a pneumonia, and done it all without losing a patient. Agnes had a 4-year-old daughter named Ruby, who had been running a recurring fever for 2 months. 3 physicians in Cheyenne had given 3 different opinions. Agnes had spent money she didn't have and gotten answers that contradicted each other and helped her daughter not at all. She had heard about Clara Whitmore and she had come. Colt met the family at the gate and brought them in without hesitation, and when he found Clara and explained who they were, he said simply, "She needs your help. Whatever you need, you have it." Clara examined Ruby for 40 minutes. She asked Agnes questions that no physician had apparently thought to ask about the pattern of the fever, the time of day, the foods Ruby ate and didn't eat, whether there was any history of this in Agnes's family or her husband's. She listened and documented and thought, and then she said, "It's not infectious. She's not fighting a pathogen." She looked at Agnes directly. "Her body is reacting to something she's eating. Do you have wheat or rye in your house, particularly rye flour?" Agnes stared at her. "We've been baking with rye flour since October, since my husband brought a new supply from—" "Since October," Clara said. "When did the fevers start?" Agnes went very still. "November," she said. "Take the rye out of her diet completely for 3 weeks. If I'm right, the fevers will stop." Clara kept her voice clear and even. "I'll give you written instructions. If they don't stop, come back and we reassess. But I believe they will." Agnes's husband, who had been silent through the whole examination, looked at Clara and said, "3 physicians couldn't tell us that." "3 physicians were looking for an infection," Clara said. "Sometimes the answer isn't a pathogen. Sometimes the answer is simpler, and it takes more questions to find it." Agnes took Clara's hands in both of hers, and her eyes were bright, and she said, "Can I write to you after the 3 weeks?" "Please do," Clara said. "I need to know if I'm right." Agnes wrote 3 weeks later. The fevers had stopped after 8 days. She included a signed statement that was 2 pages long, and at the bottom of it she had written, "My daughter is well." Clara Whitmore did what 4 physicians could not. I will say this to anyone who asks under any circumstances for the rest of my life. Clara read it at the kitchen table, while Colt sat across from her, and she held her professional neutrality for approximately 30 seconds before she pressed her hand to her mouth and breathed very carefully through the feeling that was too large for the kitchen. Colt didn't say anything. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers briefly 1 second, 2, and then withdrew it and picked up his coffee cup and looked at his ledger. It was, she thought, one of the most precisely calibrated gestures she had ever received from another human being. Not too much, not too little, exactly what was needed and then done. The formal hearing notice came in the 3rd week of April. The Pennsylvania Medical Board had reviewed the submitted evidence and had determined that given the volume and credibility of the supporting materials, an in-person hearing in Philadelphia was no longer required. Instead, a formal panel review would be conducted via written submission with a decision to follow within 30 days. The critical addition, Dr. Marcus Haverford, had been notified that 3 of his supporting witnesses had recanted their statements after being separately contacted by the board's investigator, a development the letter described in dry institutional language that barely contained what it actually meant. Haverford's testimony was now largely uncorroborated. Clara read the letter standing at the kitchen counter, and then put it down and stood very still for a moment. "What does it say?" Colt asked from the doorway. "His witnesses recanted." She turned around. "2 people who signed statements against me told the truth when someone asked them directly and officially." Her voice was steady. "Someone got to them. Someone with the authority to make recanting feel safer than lying." Colt looked at her steadily. The governor's office made some inquiries, he said after a moment, about the professional conduct of the complaint process. She stared at him. You didn't tell me. I didn't want to tell you something might happen and then have it not happen. He kept his voice even. I should have told you. I'm telling you now. She looked at the letter. She looked at him. She thought about a woman who had decided she was done with dependence, done with building things on someone else's structural supports, done with the particular vulnerability of trusting that the people around her were who they presented themselves to be. She thought about Colt Maddox, who had not asked her permission to go to the governor's office because he had not made it about her permission. He had made it about what was right, and then done the right thing. And now her witnesses had spoken the truth because someone with institutional weight had asked them directly. She thought about the difference between a man who used power over you and a man who used power for you, and how rarely she had encountered the second kind, and how completely and without ceremony this particular man had rearranged her understanding of what the second kind looked like in practice. Thank you, she said. You built the case, he said. I just opened a door. You opened several doors. You had the evidence to walk through them. He pushed off the door frame. 30 days. Then we know. She nodded. 30 days. She could hold 30 days. She had been holding harder things for longer, and she had done it alone, and now she was doing it with 43 men behind her, and a foreman's wife who was her friend, and a physician in Casper, who wrote devastating letters, and a man who stood in doorways and opened things without asking to be thanked. 30 days was nothing. What came after 30 days? That was the thing she was holding more carefully in the interior place where she kept what mattered and hadn't yet found the language for. Colt was already back at his desk when she came through the hallway, and he didn't look up, but he had moved the coffee cup to the near side of the table without being asked, which meant he had already known she would sit down, which meant he was paying the kind of attention that you only pay to something you've decided is permanent. She sat down. She pulled the cup toward her. She opened her notebook. Outside April was doing the first tentative things that April does in Wyoming. Hesitant, and then committed the way every real change begins. And Clara Whitmore sat at a kitchen table with her case file and her coffee, and 30 days between her and the rest of her life. And she felt for the first time in longer than she could calculate, like someone who was exactly where she was supposed to be. The 30 days did not move at an even pace. The first 10 passed with the ordinary momentum of the ranch in spring calving season, which meant irregular sleep for everyone, and a particular kind of exhausted teamwork that Clara had come to understand was one of the ways the Maddox Ranch expressed its own character. She moved through those days doing what she did, checking on men who had been out in the cold too long, treating the small injuries that multiplied in a season of hard physical work, monitoring Callum's lungs, which continued to improve with a consistency that she found genuinely gratifying. She did not think about the letter constantly. She thought about it the way you think about something important that you have no power to accelerate in the background. Steady, like a sound below the range of conversation that you only fully hear when everything else goes quiet. Colt did not bring it up. He let her lead on the subject, which was, she had learned his way. He understood the difference between support and pressure, and he operated on the right side of that line with a consistency she had stopped taking for granted and started actively appreciating. The 11th day brought a development that had nothing to do with Philadelphia. A young woman appeared at the ranch gate on a Wednesday morning, 20 years old, maybe 21, traveling alone on a horse that looked tired. Her name was May Sutton. She had ridden from a homestead 12 miles north because her mother had been sick for a week and nobody had come, and she had heard from Agnes Doyle that there was a nurse at the Maddox Ranch who listened and helped. Clara rode back with her without consulting anyone. She left a note on the kitchen table, gone north with a patient. Back by evening. C. Colt read the note at noon and stood in the kitchen for a moment, and then went back to the calving barn because there was nothing else to do, and because Clara Whitmore did not need his permission to practice medicine. May's mother, Ellen Sutton, was 46 years old and had been running a low fever for 9 days with a pain in her right side that had started dull and gone sharp. Clara examined her for 20 minutes and felt the specific tension in the lower right quadrant that she recognized immediately and that tightened every professional instinct she had. "How sharp is the pain right now?" she asked, keeping her voice completely neutral. "Bad," Ellen said. "Worse when I move. On a scale 1 is nothing, 10 is the worst you've ever felt." 7, going to 8. Clara kept her hands gentle, and her expression steady, and her mind moving very fast. She looked at May in the doorway. "I need you to go to Maddox Ranch and tell Mr. Maddox that I need a wagon to Cheyenne and I need it now. Not in an hour. Now." May went white. "Is she? She's going to be fine," Clara said with the particular certainty that was a medical tool, and also in this moment true, but only if they moved in the next 4 hours. "I need the wagon. Go." May went. Clara stayed with Ellen, talking to her, monitoring the pain, doing everything she could to keep her still and calm and breathing evenly, and thinking about the 47-minute ride to the ranch, and the 47 minutes back, and the window of time she was working inside of, and the fact that she had caught this in time barely, and the fact that catching it in time was entirely because Agnes Doyle had told May Sutton about the nurse who listened. The wagon arrived in 50 minutes. Colt was driving it himself. He came through the door, read Clara's face, and said nothing unnecessary. "Ready." 2 minutes. She had Ellen wrapped and ready. "Careful with the road. Every bump matters." "I know a smoother route. Adds 10 minutes. Take it." I took it. Clara rode in the back with Ellen, one hand on her pulse and one braced against the wagon's side, talking Ellen through every slow mile, with the calm that was by now as natural to her as breathing, not performed, not effortful, simply who she was when the work was real. Dr. Fitch met them at his office door. Clara gave him her assessment in 60 seconds, precise and sequential, and he listened without interrupting, and then said, "Agreed on all points. I'll have her prepped in 10 minutes. He looked at Clara. "You want to observe?" "I want to assist," she said. He looked at her for 1 second. "Then wash your hands." She assisted. She stood across the table from Aldous Fitch and handed instruments and monitored and anticipated, and at the end of it, Dr. Fitch looked up and said, "Clean catch, Miss Whitmore. Another 6 hours, and we'd have been in a very different conversation." "Agnes Doyle's daughter," Clara said. He raised an eyebrow. "Ellen came to me because her daughter heard about Ruby from Agnes, the referral chain. She was already cleaning instruments. That's why it matters. Not just the patient in front of you. Everyone they tell afterward." Fitch was quiet for a moment. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking about what you said. About training. About women in frontier medicine." He set down his instruments. "I have a proposal if you're willing to hear it." Ellen Sutton recovered. May sat with her mother through the night at Dr. Fitch's clinic and sent a wire to the ranch the next morning that said only, "She's well. Thank you. May Sutton." Clara received the wire at the kitchen table and read it and set it carefully in the file she'd been building. Not the medical board file, a different one. Newer, started in the last few weeks without fully acknowledging what she was building. Dr. Fitch's proposal was this. He wanted to establish a formal training program for frontier nurses in Wyoming Territory. Women who could work in isolated homesteads and ranches and small settlements where physicians couldn't reach. He wanted Clara to design the curriculum. He wanted to use the Cheyenne Clinic as the base. He wanted her name on the program. She had told him she needed to think about it. She was still thinking about it 5 days later when the letter came. It arrived on a Friday. May, now the cold finally breaking into something that felt like the world remembering it could be generous. Pete Darby brought it from the Cheyenne Rider with the careful handling of a man who understood what was inside, and he found Clara in the bunkhouse doing a routine check on Callum's lungs. Clear now, genuinely clear, the best sound she had heard in 3 months, and he held the envelope out without a word. She saw the seal. She finished listening to Callum's lungs. She pressed the stethoscope to his chest one more time, confirming what she already knew, and said, "Clear, completely clear. You're done with the twice-weekly checks, monthly from here." Callum looked at her. He looked at the envelope in Pete's hand. "You gonna open that?" "In a minute," she said. She walked out of this bunkhouse and stood in the open air and held the envelope and breathed for a moment. She thought about Cheyenne in January. She thought about a bench and $11 and a pulse that was still there when a man pressed 2 fingers to her throat and decided it was enough reason to act. She thought about 6 years of training and one man's decision to use power as a weapon, and the long westward train ride that had not felt like a beginning, but had been one anyway. She opened the letter. The Pennsylvania State Medical Board had completed its formal review of the complaint filed by Dr. Marcus Haverford against Clara Whitmore, registered nurse, formerly of Philadelphia General Hospital. The complaint was dismissed in its entirety. The board found the original charges unsupported by credible evidence. The documentation submitted in Miss Whitmore's defense, including signed attestations from 3 licensed Wyoming physicians, 31 patient statements, and supporting correspondence from the Office of the Wyoming Territorial Governor, demonstrated a clear and consistent record of competent, ethical, and effective medical practice. Furthermore, the board noted that 2 witnesses who had originally provided statements in support of the complaint had subsequently recanted, citing professional pressure from Dr. Haverford as the reason for their initial false testimony. The board had referred the matter of Dr. Haverford's conduct to the Pennsylvania State Medical Ethics Commission for review. Miss Whitmore's record was hereby cleared. Her nursing certification was fully reinstated. The board extended its formal acknowledgement of the professional conduct demonstrated throughout the review process. Clara read it once, then again. Then she folded it along its original crease and held it against her chest and looked at the Wyoming sky, which was enormous and blue, and entirely indifferent to human drama in a way that she had come to love rather than find cold. Haverford was referred to the Ethics Commission. She had not let herself want that. She had focused on her own clearance, her own record, her own ground to stand on. She had not let herself want the accountability piece, because wanting things you can't control is a different kind of suffering, and she had had enough suffering. But it had happened anyway, not because she'd fought for it, but because she had told the truth, and kept telling it, and built the record, and let the record speak. And somewhere in Philadelphia, 2 people had decided that the truth mattered more than the protection of a man who had made them lie. She stood there for a long time. Then she went to find Colt. How was in the calving barn? She walked in and found him crouched beside a new calf with the patient attention of a man who understood that some things required your full presence, regardless of what else was pressing. And he looked up when she came in and read her face before she said a word. He stood up. She held out the letter. I took it, read it, handed it back. He looked at her directly, and his expression was the most open she had ever seen it. Not the controlled neutrality he used for difficult things. Not the quiet attention he used for ordinary ones, but something that was simply and entirely real. Dismissed, he said. Entirely. Her voice was steady. And Haverford has been referred to the Ethics Commission. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, and was more than one. Good, he said, and the single word carried the weight of Tommy Reeves and Ward Connolly, and Callum's lungs, and Jesse in the snow, and every morning's coffee, set on the far side of the table, without ceremony. I want to take Dr. Fitch's offer, she said. He waited. The training program. I want to design it and run it. I want to train women to work in frontier medicine, because there are Ellen Suttons on homesteads, 12 miles from the nearest road, who are 6 hours from dying of something treatable, and there are daughters like May who don't know where to ride until someone tells them. She held his gaze. That means I'm not leaving in June. That means I stay. Colt was quiet for a moment. The calf moved in the straw behind him. Outside the ranch was doing all the sounds of a working day in May. I was going to ask you to stay, he said. I've been working out how to ask you since February. February, she repeated. The snow days, when you told me about Helen Cross. He looked at her with the directness that was simply his nature, no performance, no deflection. I knew then. I kept waiting for the right moment, and then I realized you don't wait for the right moment with something real. You just say it. Then say it, she said. I want you to stay, he said. Not for the ranch, not for the men, for me. Because you are the most clear-eyed, capable, honest person I have encountered in my life, and I would very much like to keep encountering you for a long time if you're willing. Clara looked at him. She thought about the woman on the train west who had decided she was done with dependence and done with building on other people's foundations. She thought about how she had come here with nothing, and had built something anyway, not on his foundation, but alongside it with her own materials, and her own labor, and her own very particular stubbornness, and how that made the difference between owing something and choosing something. She was choosing this. "I'm willing," she said. He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps, and she let him, and when he put his hands on either side of her face and looked at her for one long, deliberate moment before he kissed her, it was with the same quality as everything else he did fully present. No hesitation, completely certain of the thing he was doing. It was, she thought, exactly right. Behind them the calf made a small noise of total indifference, which made her laugh against his mouth, and he laughed too. A real laugh, full and unguarded, the laugh of a man who had been serious for a long time and had just remembered he didn't have to be. They were married in July on the ranch on a Saturday morning when the weather was good and the whole of the Maddox ranch turned out in their best clothing, which in several cases meant clean hats and polished boots and nothing more, and it was entirely sufficient. Margaret Darby stood beside Clara. Pete stood beside Colt. Jesse Alcott, 19 years old and fully recovered and deeply invested in the proceedings, had appointed himself unofficial organizer and had spent 2 days arranging things that nobody had asked him to arrange with the earnest good faith that was entirely characteristic of him. Brody Walsh, whose ribs had healed straight and whose voice had not diminished in volume, informed the assembled group that he personally considered this outcome to have been inevitable from approximately the 3rd day of Clara's arrival, and that he had not said so earlier because he valued his continued employment. Hector Ruiz, whose finger pointed correctly, and had for months said that he had known from the moment Clara said the words, 30 seconds of very bad, and then delivered on them with complete accuracy. Callum Reed, whose lungs were clear, said nothing at all. He simply stood in the front and looked at Clara with the expression of a man who understood better than most what it meant to be in a room with someone who had decided your life was worth fighting for. Ward Connolly stood to the side with his right arm, healed, functional fully, his folded across his chest, and when the brief ceremony concluded, and Colt kissed his wife in front of 43 ranch hands, and 1 foreman's wife, and 1 very organized 19-year-old Ward, looked at his hand for a moment, and then looked up at the sky, and said nothing to anyone, which was his particular way of saying everything. The training program launched in September. Clara spent the summer designing it with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. What the women needed to know, in what order, with what practical application, across what geographic territory. She wrote a curriculum that was 40 pages long and had been reviewed by Dr. Fitch and Dr. Lena Hargrove, and at Dr. Hargrove's insistence, by 2 women who had been doing informal frontier medicine for decades without any official recognition, whose practical knowledge filled in gaps that no textbook had addressed. The first cohort was 8 women. They came from homesteads and ranches and small settlements across Wyoming territory, ranging in age from 19 to 53. They had in common intelligence, resourcefulness, and the particular pragmatic courage of people who had been dealing with medical emergencies alone for years and had always known they needed better tools. Clara taught them the way. Helen Cross had taught her not as subordinates receiving instruction, but as practitioners developing mastery, with the understanding that a patient who trusts their caregiver tells the truth about their pain, and a practitioner who understands the person in front of them makes fewer mistakes than one who only understands the condition. She taught them about Ward's arm and Jesse's hypothermia and Callum's lungs, not as case studies, as people. She taught them that medicine was not a performance of authority, but an act of presence, and that the most important instrument in any kit was the quality of attention you brought to the room. Agnes Doyle attended the first session sitting in the back, Ruby on her lap, not enrolled just there, as she had said she would be for the rest of her life, for whatever it required. At the end of the first day, a woman named Ruth Callahan, 44 years old, who had been managing her homestead's medical needs for 18 years, came to Clara after the others had gone and said, "I've been doing some of this right." "You've been doing most of it right," Clara said. "I'm going to show you the rest." Ruth looked at her for a moment. "Why did you come to Wyoming?" Clara thought about a train station in January, and a bench, and a pulse too slow and too uneven, and a man who pressed 2 fingers to her throat and decided it was enough. "Someone picked me up off a floor," she said, "and gave me a room with good light." Ruth nodded slowly. "And now you're doing the same." Clara considered that. It was not how she had thought of it, but it was accurate. "Yes," she said. "I suppose I am." By the end of the first year, 8 trained nurses were working across Wyoming territory. By the end of the second 23, Dr. Hargrove brought the program to the attention of the territorial legislature, and a formal resolution of recognition was passed. Not legislation, not yet, but acknowledgement, which was its own kind of beginning. Haverford lost his position at Philadelphia General in November of the first year, following the Ethics Commission review. Clara received a brief notification from the board. She read it once, filed it, and did not think about it again for a long time, because she had learned something important about the difference between justice and the ongoing work of building things that matter. They are not the same process, and one does not require you to wait for the other. Colt expanded the ranch's north pasture that spring, adding 800 acres and 12 new hands, and the bunkhouse grew, and the medical room that Clara had established in the main house grew with it, and by the second summer, it was less a ranch nurse's station, and more a small clinic that served not only the Maddox hands, but families from the surrounding territory, who had learned through word and wire, and the particular network of trust that grows in places where people depend on each other. That the woman at the Maddox Ranch listened and helped and had trained others to do the same. Jesse Alcott, 20 years old, and no longer the youngest hand on the ranch, asked Clara one evening if she thought the program would ever reach Colorado. "Eventually," she said. "What about further Kansas, maybe? One territory at a time." She looked at him. "Why?" He looked at his healed hand. "My sister's down in Kansas. She's been wanting to do nursing work for years. Didn't know there was a path." He glanced up. "I wrote her about you. She wrote back and said she wants to come." Clara thought about a woman on a train going west because all the eastern doors were closed. She thought about paths that don't exist until someone walks them, and then walks them again, until they're clear enough for others to follow. "Tell her to come," she said. On a September evening of the second year, Clara sat on the porch of the main house with Colt beside her, and the ranch was doing all the sounds of a place that was alive and working and intact, and she had a letter in her lap from Ruth Callahan, in which Ruth reported that she had successfully managed a difficult childbirth on an isolated homestead, mother and child, both healthy, using the techniques Clara had taught her, and that the family had named the baby Clara Ruth, which Ruth found somewhat overwhelming, and Clara found entirely. "She named the baby after you," Colt said, reading over her shoulder. "After both of us. Clara Ruth. That's a good name." She folded the letter and held it against her chest, the way she had held the medical board letter, the one that had said dismissed in its entirety, and meant that the truth had been slower than the lie, but had arrived more completely. She thought about how much had happened since January of the previous year. She thought about everything that had been taken from her and what she had built in its place, which was not a replacement, but a transformation, not the same shape, not the same materials, something larger and more grounded, and more truly her own than anything she had constructed before. She thought about what she would tell Jesse's sister when she arrived from Kansas. About what it meant to go somewhere alone, with nothing but your skills and your willingness to use them. About floors and benches and pulses under 2 fingers and rooms with good light. About the fact that the thing you think is the end is sometimes the terrain of the beginning, if you are stubborn enough and honest enough and fortunate enough to find in the most unlikely circumstances one person who looks at what you are rather than what you've lost and decides without hesitation that it's enough. Colt put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and neither of them said anything for a while, because they were practical people who understood that some things are complete without commentary. The ranch went on doing what it did. The evening settled. Somewhere in Wyoming, 23 women who had learned to listen carefully were sitting with someone in pain and doing what Clara had taught them, and doing it well. And Clara Whitmore, Clara Maddox, sat on her own porch with her letter and her husband and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have fought hard and built honestly and arrived without fully realizing the moment of arrival exactly where they were always going. She had come west with nothing and had built everything that mattered. She had been picked up off a floor and had stood up and kept standing, and she had never not once stopped moving toward the work. That was who she was. That was what she left behind. Not a title, not an institution, not a name on a board's letterhead, but 23 women in the field, and more coming, and a baby named Clara Ruth in a homestead far north, and 43 men who were alive and knew why, and a man beside her who had seen exactly who she was from the first moment and had never asked her to be anything else. In the wild, unforgiving West. In the winter of 1887, a freezing woman on a train station floor had held on to a carpet bag full of instruments and refused to let go. She had been right not to let go. The work had been worth every single mile.